Lakeside is pleased to sponsor this exciting broadcast featuring Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy on Voice America.
Welcome to Creating Presence with your hosts, Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy. Over the next hour, you'll learn about the processes that steer our hearts and minds and how to improve our collective social health.
Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandy Bloom, and I'm here with my colleague, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, everyone.
Sarah and I have developed an organizational intervention to help organizations integrate trauma-informed practice. And we use the acronym PRESENCE. So what it stands for, the P is for partnership and power, R for reverence and restoration, the first D is emotional wisdom and empathy, the S is for safety and social responsibility, the second E is for embodiment and enactment, nature and nurture, C is for culture and complexity, and the third E is emergence and evolution. In this podcast today, we're looking at the letter C for culture and complexity, and we're talking with two people who have a lot of expertise in the area of producing collective social health. At least that's what we're hoping for. So that's what we're going to take a deeper dive into with a social health focus on the challenges of culture and complexity.
So we're really going to look at community work, and it's so important to think about the concepts of culture and complexity when we're talking about communities. And when we think about culture, Sandy, you and I have a very simplistic definition. We sort of refer to it as just how we do things based on how we've done things. And really, any time that humans get together, they create a culture. So that means families have their own culture, schools have a culture, and organizations have cultures. And we're really very deeply influenced by the culture that we're a part of. And part of this is due to the fact that humans have really long periods of childhood, much longer than most other animals, mammals in particular. Sometimes our childhood spans, all the way through our 20s. And that experience then of kind of being in a culture influences us while our brains are still developing. And so this idea of how we do things or culture, it affects the neural pathways that are formed when we're really young. And those neural pathways then shape how we think, how we feel, and how we behave in response to other people and in situations that we encounter. So while that's really important for our early childhood and how we're growing up and how our neural pathways are forming, it also influences us even as adults. So the culture that we work in or the culture of the communities that we live in are also going to influence how we think, feel, and behave. And sometimes when how we do things or our culture doesn't align with our personal values, as that sometimes happens in our workplaces or in our communities, can be really hard to recognize that misalignment, and even more uncomfortable to resist it when we encounter that misalignment. And so that's why in Creating Presence, we have shaped it as an organizational intervention. Because it's not enough just for individuals to be trauma informed, the organizational culture also has to be trauma informed, because that can have an even greater impact on behavior than individual knowledge. So our goal in Creating Presence is to align organizational culture with trauma responsive practices. And sometimes that means little tweaks, revising language or fine tuning to make intentions more explicit. Other times that means overhauling policies or upending practices that inadvertently re-traumatize people. So that's kind of the culture part of culture and complexity.
what I think it's hard for people to recognize often is that every organization that everybody works in is itself a complex adaptive systems. It's a living system. It's not a machine. And complexity is a tough thing to get your head around because it does explain why simple solutions to complex problems never work, because everything is connected to everything else in a living system. So you have to really look at the whole. And that is kind of sums up what was so important about the study that we're going to begin talking about here today with our guests. It was breakthrough knowledge in 1998 with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, because it made, in a way, it made things simpler, but in another way, it made things much more complex. It provided the scientific underpinning for what actually is causing so much of the physical and psychological and social suffering that exists all over our society. And yet, in highlighting that, it showed how complex preventing all those problems are, because they require a real shift in almost everything about our culture.
We're going to welcome, I like to think of Dr. Anda as the trauma-informed like superstar. And he is the co-principal investigator of the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And we're also going to welcome Dr. Laura Porter. And together, they've created ACE Interface, bringing together over 2 decades of experience in helping leaders to develop and disseminate educational products and empowerment strategies that help communities throughout the nation to dramatically improve population health. In this capacity, they have become thought partners, educators, consultants, and coaches in over 24 states. And they're going to share some of the findings about their very important work.
So Dr. Robert Anda is a board certified internist, as well as he has a master's degree in public health. And before the ACEs study, he'd spent at least 20 years doing research in the US Public Health Service at the CDC. He's authored or co-authored more than 70 publications from the ACEs study. And as I said, that was first published in 1998. The ACEs study has changed the face of healthcare, mental health care, and with some luck, will change the face of education and government as well. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Sandy. It's really a pleasure to be here. And by the way, I do have to say that that you are one of my superstars, and the work that we ended up doing on the ACE study was built on the shoulders of the superstars who did the breakthrough work on traumatic stress. And so you and others have made the work possible.
Thank you, Rob.
We're also excited to welcome our other guest, Dr. Laura Porter. From 1998 to 2013, Laura Porter directed the Washington State Family Policy Council and Office of ACE Partnerships. In these roles, she worked with elected senators and representatives from the 4 caucuses of the Washington legislature, the superintendent of public instruction and governor, and 4 members of the governor's cabinet. Laura and her colleagues developed a unique model for improving the capacity of communities to deliver stunning results for a small investment, the self-healing communities model. Welcome, Laura. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, you have also served on the board of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. So definitely we wanted to mention that also. You and Sandy have that in common.
Yes.
So Rob, in case there are people who don't know about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, or what we call, of course, the ACEs study, could you tell us a little bit about your work on the original study, and like how you got inspired to even focus on that, and kind of just summarize the findings for our listeners?
Yeah, your intro on culture and community really took me back in time to when I came to the CDC. There was a transition, an understanding of how important chronic illness was, that it surpassed infectious diseases. So I came in to study chronic disease epidemiology, and there was an emphasis on risk factors, especially personal behaviors, things like smoking, alcohol use, diet, physical activity. And I noticed that, for example, like for smoking, there since the Surgeon General's report came out in the 60s, smoking had come down in the US population, but it had leveled off at about 25%. And I became frustrated that we kept trying to tell people what to do when it wasn't working. The behaviors weren't changing. And why does that not work? And and I became interested in, well, why are the behaviors there in spite of general knowledge about the negative consequences? And uh, I did a study on the relationship between depression and smoking in the U.S. population. We saw a very powerful relationship. Um, I was studying cardiovascular disease, and we saw a relationship between depression and how much hope people had in their lives and the incidence of cardiovascular disease. And so I was working my way towards, well, what's the ground floor for behaviors and even the long-term risk for chronic illnesses. And I met Dr. Vince Folletti from the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego, and he had found a relationship between childhood sexual abuse and obesity in his clinic. So we got together, one thing led to another. I did a literature review going back 15 years under the mesh heading of child abuse and neglect. And I read every abstract. I didn't read all the articles, but I read all of the abstracts. And I saw that, well, much great work had been done. It was just really sort of scattered. I thought about like a bucket full of BBs of information that need to be put together into one place. And so we ended up getting the funding to look at 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan, and we gathered all the BBs, all the little bits of information, and we called those adverse childhood experiences the exposures. And what was new about it is we looked at 10 different forms of adversity or trauma. Most studies had looked at only like one or two sources of trauma or adversity. So we asked people about childhood abuse, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. We asked the study participants about neglect, emotional, physical neglect, growing up with domestic violence, growing up where there was substance abuse in their home, growing up with people that had been, if someone was incarcerated in their home, losing someone, that relationship to incarceration, or the stress, the relational stress of being in a home where there was parental separation or divorce. So there were 10 of those, and I was totally wet behind the ears on this whole trauma thing. And when we got the data back, I was stunned at how common each one of those were. And I think probably our culture at large was largely ignorant to how common each one of those experiences were. And the next thing we found is that those kind of experiences in a child's life rarely occur in isolation. Where there's one of those in the environment that they grew up in, there's usually one or more, two or three more of those experiences. And we dealt with the complexity of the interrelatedness of adverse childhood experiences by creating something really simple that we called the ACE score, which was a simple integer count from 0 to 10 of the 10 ACEs. We count each 1 point. We didn't weigh one more experience more than another. And what popped out was totally stunning. We had no idea that as the accumulation of adversity in a child's life goes up from 0 to 10 in a population, that there was this, what we call a dose-response relationship. As the score went up, the probability, the prevalence and incidence of many of the major health and social problems that CDC was dealing with went up very powerfully. Like, for example, with addiction from 0 to 1, it doubles, triples to 2, a score of 2, goes up to like 20 for an A score of 6 or 7. And we saw this over and over and over again for many of the major things that were siloed at the CDC, which is part of what we're going to talk about, I think, in culture, that there was no awareness of how interrelated all of the prevention activities at CDC were in going back to the origins, which is the developmental impact of traumatic stress in the lives of children. So there was a sense of disbelief. And you're making me think about what it was like, the culture that I was in. When we were designing this study, we were told, well, this isn't, you're not studying public health. Childhood trauma and adversity is not a public health problem. That belongs in some other institution or somewhere else. So it's very difficult to get it done. And then we had this stunning information that was first published in 1998. And we had the same experience in sending this, what I saw as the most powerful public health information I'd ever seen, getting journals to accept it. We sent it out to all the major medical journals, and we got feedback saying, well, we don't believe it, or people make up stories about their lives to cover up for their quote unquote bad behaviors. If you can't tell us the biologic mechanisms by which this occurs, we don't believe you. And so we ended up sending the first article, which now has become sort of a landmark, to the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, which is a brand new journal, and was hungry for publications. Right, new journals need publications, and that was our first publication. And so it was. I think in the context of this podcast, what we faced in terms of fixed ideas, the culture of the CDC, the culture of public health wasn't ready for this. It didn't fit into the paradigms that had been worked in for so many decades, and it challenged thinking. And it challenged boundaries. Thinking boundaries, financing boundaries, and turf. The turf battles around the silos, and so the challenge became, how do we use this in a way that can integrate along deeply entrenched lines of thinking and funding streams?
Yeah.
So I hope we've come a long way since there. And when we come back from our break, we'll hear more from Dr. Rob Anda and Laura Porter about the ACE's connections and relationships to culture and complexity. And we'll be right back after this message.
If you would like your organization to be aligned in its values, practices, and skills to be trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and trauma-resilient, Creating Presence is the program you are looking for. The Creating Presence model is an online and coach certification program authored by internationally renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom. This program is designed to help your organization become certified as a safe and value-aligned place for both your staff and clients. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, the host of this broadcast. For more information as to how your organization can create presence, go to creatingpresence.net.
Welcome to Creating Presence with your hosts, Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy. Over the next hour, you'll learn about the processes that steer our hearts and minds and how to improve our collective social health.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And we're talking with our guest today, Dr. Robert Anda, the co-investigator on the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and Dr. Laura Porter, co-lead on ACE's interface. And we're talking to them about social health as it relates to culture and complexity.
Laura, tell us about ACE Interface and where you see the role of ACE Interface in supporting complex systems and varying cultures in your community work.
ACE Interface is a small business. It's just Dr. Anda and myself. We provide education and coaching for communities and states across the country and in several countries actually now. And our primary job is to train trainers. We teach people how to teach about adverse childhood experience, neuroscience, epigenetics, and how resilient communities operate in order to prevent adverse childhood experience and to stop that progression of adversity that all too often happens when the same people who have childhood adversity end up being the adults who have the most adult adversity. And that progression of adversity is a lot of how we end up with intergenerational transmission of ACEs. And we train trainers not only to teach about this science, also to facilitate dialogue, to engage the community in innovation and action and evaluation. And we teach them about a process that we've learned through our work is really powerful for communities to become healing-centered places. And that process really is anchored by this notion of increasing the number of people that we think of as leaders, that every single human being can be a leader in a self-healing community. And in that way, we help communities shift the culture. We think about culture as the, sort of the abstract and learned patterns, the way we are with one another day by day. Mostly that happens on autopilot. And so we expect our master trainers to be able to help communities take that off of autopilot, help people question the way they are with one another, help people have dialogue about what do we really want for our grandchildren, for our great-grandchildren. And in those dialogues, we find that people really reconsider the core values of the community and the way the community operates. And community, that can be an organization, that can be a place, that can be an association of professionals, right? Any group of people that tends to have those patterns and norms that need to be questioned and need to be considered. So ACE Interface is really in the business of anchoring change in place and in people, and helping people understand the processes and the information that can really help them reconsider mental models, reconsider values, reconsider the way we are with one another.
Tell us a little bit about the impact that you are hoping to have with the dissemination of your research and the use of your tools.
Well, some of your audience may know that Rob was a lead consultant for our work in Washington for many years, and I was the director of that work, a partnership between the state government and communities across the state. And what we found was that when people really understand this information deeply and they engage in these community change processes, what we see is the reduction in the rates of many social and health problems concurrently. And that's what we would expect because ACEs drive many different outcomes. And so when I left state service, I was curious, when I'm not a funder anymore, can we as consultants and support people, can we help communities reduce the rates of major problems? And after almost a couple decades now of us doing this work, the answer is yes. We see communities very successfully reducing the rates of dropping out of school, of childhood asthma, of adult mental health problems, including depression and anxiety. And at the same time, we see this alarming increase across the nation in the kinds of mental health challenges that we know communities can affect, especially depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety, those worries and sense of helplessness that really communities are very powerful in ameliorating. So we're very hopeful that engaged communities that understand a little bit about complexity and culture and can engage human beings in their everyday lives and change. That's what it takes. I think there's a misnomer in the field that we can change professionals and that will change culture. In fact, ACEs, the origin of ACEs is inside of families, inside of relationship, inside of households, inside of neighborhoods, right? We need to change the way we are with one another. And that includes professional action, but professional action will never be enough. We actually have to reach individuals in their private lives, in their family lives, in their community lives. And that's really where ACE Interface is centered. This train the trainer, supporting the leadership expansion of every single person in order to shift that cultural pattern that results in ACEs that are way too high.
You know, listening to that, Rob, it strikes me that your background is so different from the work that you guys are doing now, from research to working with whole communities. What's that been like for you?
That's for me, Sandy.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, what it's been like for me is getting out and seeing how people respond to the information, um, and interacting with these trainees over 3 days or doing conferences and seminars. And what I see is people are motivated by this information. The first thing I see is a light bulb go off. You know, when you're speaking to audiences and you
Yep.
see the faces change and they're taking it in and something happens in their minds, I think there's a frame shift for many people. And I think I think it motivates people to do something different. And I think of that motivation as the beginnings of interrupting the chain of transmission of adversity. No, it's ultimately it's person to person transmission. The way that we interact with each other can can be stressful or it can be nurturing and wonderful. And um, I know that may sound really simplistic, but if this information, when we put it out, if we had said it was representing a virus, people would have believed it. And then uncover, well, no, we were measuring childhood experience. So I believe that this information can interrupt the person-to-person transmission of trauma and adversity in maybe small ways, cumulatively, or for some people in big ways. But I think when people understand that what the way we treat each other gets embedded in our bodies, especially for children, and can have lasting impact on the many things that Laura mentioned, from how kids do in school, to the way that people form relationships, um, to addiction, mental health problems, or even later in life to things like cardiovascular disease or cancer or diabetes. And you know, people, I didn't know that when I did the work.
Right.
Um, and the other thing that I think of, Sandy, is I don't know to what extent we keep preaching to the choir, where we talk to people who already know this information. And I don't think most people in our culture really have a fundamental understanding of how this works and how we interact with each other and can influence the brain development of children, that it can influences how our genome is read and used, that has lasting impact on many aspects of human well-being and human development. And so my passion is to keep getting this out there as widely as possible and try to scale this up. Um, and that's a fundamental public health concept of public education. Um, and I believe that it can have a very powerful influence. Um, my hope is that sometime in the next, in the next decade or two, that most people, a majority of people, will have some basic understanding that will become embedded in culture, that will be passed on from one generation to the next.
Me
I
too.
love, sorry, Sandy. I love the way that you both have framed this vision, and sort of the beginning work of dissemination to communities with the, you know, phrasing, like if you give people the information, you know, they will do very wise things with it. That just, it feels so empowering. Let's give our listeners some examples of some of the wise things that communities have done and are doing, with this knowledge.
Oh my goodness. Such inspiring work is happening across the country. Everything from reinventing the role of police to be supporting young people and their families, understanding that behavior is a language of sorts. And when young people begin to break the law, that's a way of speaking about what's happening in their lives, in their neighborhoods or in their families. And so in one group of cities, they've changed the role of police to upon the first arrest, instead of making that arrest, they go to the home and they offer the adults in that household a contract to be to go through and just a review of how the family's doing. And if the family decides to follow through on that, they get support for the next 90 days to a year in order to address family challenges. And what has happened there is that nearly every family has signed that contract. They found really serious challenges in those families, including violence in those homes among the adults, addiction, major mental illness, etc. And families really wishing they had help and support, but not knowing how to approach getting it. And those children then don't have a record. Those families become more well. So the notion of police can have a completely different role is one of the inspiring inventions. In the state where I live, legislators decided to relook at sentencing guidelines and give the option of people that are spending time in prison who have children can spend the last year of their sentence at home, reuniting with their children with structured support and help for becoming the great parents they've always wished they could be. And of course, because incarceration is disproportionately affecting minority people, these benefits of bringing families back together and helping them be whole and healthy and engaged are disproportionately improving the lives of minority people. There's communities that are reinventing the way that forgiveness is occurring and making public rituals and events, and communities that have said, wait, across the world in every culture, we've had welcoming ceremonies for people who go out in the world and face danger and come back. We welcome the new person who is now coming back after having faced that danger. And so they've invented community rituals around welcoming people back after treatment for substance use. We've had substance use groups to say, we didn't understand that a small amount of stress can feel like a crisis. So we might need to reach out for help. Even when stress seems small to other people, it isn't small to me. And so to surround oneself with people who understand how human beings are affected by adversity means that we get this magical right fit between the actions of the community and who that person has become through their experience. And I think Rob and I have come to believe that that notion of right fit is probably from a living systems point of view, it's probably this leverage point where we can shift whole cultural systems in communities. In living systems theory, a small change in the feedback that keeps us stuck, a small change in that feedback can create a profound shift in the patterns. And that's what Rob and I have been after in our work with ACE interface. And we feel that the typical pattern of rejecting people, of ejecting people, when they are experiencing the very normal kinds of responses to childhood and adult adversity, that needs to change to this right fit. And people then can develop compassion for self and compassion for others. And they can also question the cultural patterns and norms and bring those up and talk about them. So I wanted to make one more point about our work, and that is we're very intentionally focused on adults. And I think that there's a mistake to be made by thinking that because we talk about childhood experience, that this work is about children. And we feel that this work is about helping parenting adults to be the parents they always have imagined and wished they could be. But parenting can be more difficult for people who've had a lot of adversity in their developmental years. And so we see this as very positive work, very healing work, and about community and cultural support for parenting adults because they are the most powerful people for shifting the cultural patterns in this living system that we call community. And I think that's important. The field has tended to move toward this notion of, if we just give children a particular set of experiences, everything will be fine. And that's probably a good idea, to give children great experiences. But that's not where the power is in the living system that we're trying to shift. The power is in the parenting adults and acknowledging the truth of their experience, which includes, in many cases, a lot of adversity.
Yeah, I don't know if we emphasized when we were first talking about the ACEs study that it was the survey was of adults, 50 or older, right, Rob? It wasn't
18 or older, yes.
Yeah, it wasn't actually focused on children. It was focused on what had happened to children. And what you're doing is, I mean, it's so exciting and inspiring to know that there are communities that really want to take advantage of what you have to offer and try to heal themselves and not just get trapped. So much of what's going on out there in the world today is a focus on, we have a mental health crisis, so we have to get more mental health treatment for individuals. And that's not going to solve the mental health crisis. So it's much more likely that a community-based cultural approach will be able to actually do something.
Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Laura Porter after this short message.
If you wish to go into production to provide your own trauma training, Lakeside Productions can provide you studio rental, design, filming, editing, learning management support, and consultation for video streaming for your organization or systems of care. Lakeside Productions has developed over 50 courses and videos that are all trauma-based and customized with a variety of applications. If you would like to have more information regarding Lakeside Productions, go to our website at lakesidetraining.org. Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome to Creating Presence with your hosts, Dr. Sandra Bloom and Sarah Yanosy. Over the next hour, you'll learn about the processes that steer our hearts and minds and how to improve our collective social health.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy, and we're going to continue our conversation now with our guests, Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Laura Porter.
Tell us about neuroscience.
Well, I'm going to go ahead, but first I want to take a minute. I want to dovetail on what Laura said before we took our break. I believe that we call our work building self-healing communities, and I've thought a lot about that. I think that this neuroscience that we're going to talk about in a minute, when people see how common ACEs are and how they accumulate and build up and have a sort of a cumulative impact on risk for a lot of many things. People see themselves, they see their own story. And I naively thought, when I saw how powerful the data was, that people understood that these things that they experienced may have affected the way they grow and develop, and that they pile up. And that's not true. Because I think most people look at their child and say, well, what happened was just normal because that's all you knew. That makes sense. So I think this ACE framework comes with a narrative capacity for people to understand themselves better, right? And to go, oh, I get, that's what happened to me. And they see, when we lay out all the various ways that ACEs accumulate and change the pathway for people's lives, they see their own pathway. And I believe that has a healing capacity for people to understand themselves. And Laura talked about forgiveness. I believe that a powerful public health problem is shame. And
Mm.
I would not have said that, 20, 30 years ago. Would have said, what are you talking about, Shay? And that it sustains the cycle of many of these behaviors. It sustains the cycle of the way we treat each other. And and I believe that the ground floor of this shift, of this cultural shift, starts with individual people, and as it accumulates and reaches critical mass in a community, that understanding of self and one's own narrative and the healing of self is what allows people to change the way they do things and change the way they look out at the world and the way they look at each other. And it's all of those accumulated shifts at the individual level that
Mm.
flow up from the bottom up at a community level revolution in the way that we interact with each other in community.
I
Um,
so
so
appreciate your explanation and your description of that process, and it really resonates for me as a parent. This concept that Sandy and I have talked about, in our social structures of parenting in private. And I think, we don't have the community support of many generations prior to ours, where people watched each other's kids playing in the street, and every grown up in the community sort of took some responsibility for helping parent and helping parents be better parents. And that, I think, really does contribute to those feelings of shame that you're describing, not just for our own individual stories, but then how we relate and how we translate that to our kids. And I feel that as a parent too.
Sarah, one of the most common things that I get after I've been at the podium or even sometimes in our trainings is parents will come up to me and say, "Oh, I get it. I understand myself better now that I understand how this works. Oh, I don't want to. I'm going to reduce my transmission, what I'm transmitting to my kids. I want to do less of what I got and more of something else." And so that's what I mean by the light bulb going on, and that generally speaking, people don't have that narrative story that this information, if presented in a simple and appropriate way, people begin to see that and become motivated. They find that their experience has value, even if it was a trauma or adversity. So I learned from it and I know how it works. And now I'm going to dedicate myself to not transmitting it to my children or in what I do in my work, whether it's in education or criminal justice or health or whatever venue I'm in. There's a deep sense of purpose that comes with understanding this information.
And that happens at both the individual level and the community level. The community has a narrative also. And so once people begin to reconstruct their own personal narratives, they can enter into a different kind of dialogue about who are we as a community and what is our story. And in places that have gone through great difficulties, either natural disasters or the decline or destruction of an industry due to international trade, and we could go on and on and on. The narrative in that community needs to shift in order for that community to become a self-healing place. And we know from studying living systems that this notion of self-similarity at different levels, there's fractals in that system, right? And so this very same dynamic that Rob has talked about, individuals going through, the community also goes through. And we can move from a place of thinking we are describing all of these negatives to we are describing the truth, and we can co-construct the truth of our future.
Right.
And that's a very different perspective. It's a very empowered perspective. And it's not about someone from the outside empowering. It's about self-empowerment. It's about shifting the narrative in a people, in a place. And it occurs at all these levels at once, right? It emerges, which is one of the principles in complex systems, emergence. And we see it over and over and over, this shift that takes place, as Rob described it, in terms of individuals and over time, the community as a whole. And a lot of that power is through narrative, which I think may be a part of the future of mental health
Yeah,
therapeutic
it's
interventions.
really
Laura,
what
you
you're
just mentioned
describing.
something really powerful, Laura, the idea of truth. You know, this is truth telling. Now, when we first did the ACE study, there was a sense of disbelief, and there's a tendency to want to shy away from the fact that trauma and adversity is endemic in every community. Endemic, that means it's well established, and it's a chronic, persistent problem, and it's painful to think about. There's grief involved in facing the truth of how we have treated each other for millennia and how we continue to do that. Um, and there's maybe fear involved in not knowing exactly what to do with it. And I think that's one of the barriers that I ran into in public health is the public health community wanted a simple solution. Well, just tell us what to do. And Laura has taught me that in community, that you don't tell people what to do, come out with well, if we just do this or that, it will be something very narrow and probably very expensive and something that has limited impact. And that this idea of this sort of swelling up ground floor of empowering individuals and community to use the information wisely and transition from how things are now to how things are going to happen next can happen and create trends in really nice trends, right? Beautiful trends in reduction of public health problems over time.
It's a huge paradigm shift for our culture and you know, this is the science that helps people to make sense out of it. And when you say, Rob, you know, it's been going on for millennium, that's another thing that people don't get is it's not their fault. This has been thousands of years of building shame in everywhere into our systems and how we deal with each other. So it's such a big shift for the culture to take on board. So, but tell us what does near science stand for? It's an acronym, isn't it?
Yeah, neuroscience is an acronym. The N stands for neuroscience, which is the understanding that came sort of along with the ACE work. They were sort of hand in glove. Neuroscientists were looking at the impact of experience on the brain, and when we did our work and the neuroscientists began to look, they said, well, that explains many of the changes in the brains of children or even adults that have been exposed to trauma. The A is for adverse childhood experiences. The E is for epigenetics, which I think is the most powerful breakthrough in understanding of the biology of living organisms ever. You know, I think more than the understanding of DNA, the fact that we have DNA is what orchestrates the use. What is the conductor of this complex set of signals that the genome represents, and that experience in large measure determines how that is conducted, how our genes are read and used, and that I believe explains the many hundreds or probably eventually thousands of ways that adversity can influence the pathways that people's life take, both behaviorally and in terms of disease or disability or social problems. So, and the R is for resilient, and I think of that. You know, Laura described it really well for resilient communities, resilient people, but really how that plays out at large at a population level in community.
Well, do you have recommendations for further research that needs to happen, or different populations or additional approaches that you think will move this movement along?
You know, I think the near science, although it's new, it's such a powerful predictor of population health that you know, I think the research will come. I think the epigenetic research will tell us more about why things happen the way they do. The question is, are the epigenetic changes something that we want to focus on and try to reverse? One of the questions that I have that's an important question is, how does different type of experience influence epigenetic changes? In other words, can treating each other more kindly, right, for example, or being nurtured, reverse the epigenetic changes that came along with adversity or trauma? I don't know the answer to that. I think it maybe, but more than deeper research, I want to see research on um, understanding how many people understand this. Not just those up in the field or people that are drawn into the field, but for the average person, and as much as there is an average person, we need to get this out to everyone. And until we get it out to the majority of the population, the kind of changes that we're talking about, the promise that this information hold is the potential is going to be limited. So I want to see the research on who's getting it, who doesn't know it, how do we get it to everyone, and then understanding how they use it so that we can help them to use it in a way that has more impact.
How would you recommend for the people that are listening that may be coming from many schools of thought and many different industries, how can we get the word out more effectively so that it really is understood by the public?
Yeah. I've had this dream now for 25 years that there would be something akin to the National Heart Association, right, or the American Cancer Society arising out of this information that takes on, literally an army of volunteers like the American Heart Association has done to get out into community and, number one, see how widely this has been disseminated and make it their mission to make sure that everyone gets this information. I think everyone has a right to know this information, just like everyone has a right to know you don't drink fecally contaminated water, right? I mean, that's a right. And this information, I don't believe that it's gotten out to any significant percent of the U.S. population. That's my belief.
Yeah,
And
no,
so
I agree.
my dream is that somewhere there will be an overarching national and then state-based institutions that flow out of that make it their mission to understand where people know it, where they don't, and to make sure that everyone gets it.
Have you seen that happening in other countries?
I have not. No, not to my knowledge.
We see that happening in some communities. That's one of the reasons that we train trainers so that they will be the cultural translators in a place. They will know their neighbors, they will know the community, and they can express the science with fidelity, but express it in a way that is received there in that place. And that is transformative, to have your neighbors and colleagues and friends who know the science. And I think of it as stringing the beads. When we see high rates of young people who are experiencing hopelessness and suicidal ideation in a local community with a kind voice and a culturally appropriate approach, we can have conversations about where might this be coming from and how do we support young parents who have children growing up so that life doesn't become that hard for our children. Those localized conversations are really powerful. And I think it's inside of that that we see this culture shift and this reduction of shame. And I think that that's an important element is, who's delivering the information? How is it delivered? And how is the culture of the people receiving it respected in the way the conversations are facilitated?
Can you speak to, Laura, I know you are on the board of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, and it ties to, I think, what we've all just been talking about the need for advocacy and stuff at a national education at a national level.
Yes, nicknamed CTIP, which is an awesome organization. And we learn from communities what is happening, and we take that voice to Congress, to state legislatures, and we also bring the opportunity that's occurring in the policy world into communities. So this lovely liaison role, allowing people to link policy and practice on the ground. And it's a very powerful connection. So it allows for the evolution of US and state policy through what's happening in communities, through the voice of the people, and really with this saturated, deep understanding of the science of how experience affects human development.
Great.
So CTIP, strong advocacy voice, strong education voice, and the board has the expertise that just won't quit. An amazing board, and the potential there is realized every day. It's very amazing work. It's a privilege to be on the board.
Thank you both so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I wish we could continue forever. And thank you for listening. We just heard from Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Laura Porter. Join us next week to continue our exploration when we talk about emergence and evolution with Chris Courtois, Jared Yates Sexton, and Jesse Kohler. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.